listener production.
Hi and welcome to The Briefing. I'm Rihanna Patrick, and on today's episode we're exploring boomer breakups. Now, the recent shock celebrity split of Hugh Jackman and Deborah Lee Furness is often used as an example of this trend. They were together for 27 years, and even though divorce rates are dropping in every other age group, recent stats show that there's an upward trend for people 50 plus getting divorced in Australia.
There's a sense when you get to your 60s that there's a hell of a lot of time left. You could have 20 or 30 solid years left where you could be fit and well, and previously that was not seen to be necessarily likely.
So what's going on here? Well, we'll take a deep dive into this surprising new relationship trend straight after the headlines. It's Wednesday, the 3rd of January, and I'm joined by Eleanor Harrison-Dengate.
Good morning, Rihanna. And in Japan, the death toll has risen to at least 50 after that massive earthquake hit the country on New Year's Day. So more aftershocks, rubble on roadways and damaged roads have been making rescue operations really difficult during the race to find survivors. At least 200 structures have caught fire following the earthquake, and at least 25 residential buildings have been levelled. But these are obviously all interim stats. There's probably a lot more to come through. Currently, there's a joint task force that's been set up there. 10,000 people are set to help in the rescue and relief operations on top of the 1,000 people who are already in the area.
Yeah, Eleanor, and it's not just this that Japan is dealing with, but there's been another tragedy overnight with a Japan Airlines passenger plane which was engulfed in flames when a Coast Guard aircraft crashed into it at Tokyo's Haneda Airport. 5 crew members of that Coast Guard aircraft were killed, but the pilot did manage to escape. He's now in hospital. All 379 passengers on board of that Japan Airlines aircraft were evacuated. And the Coast Guard plane was actually due to deliver aid to the areas hit by that powerful earthquake you mentioned earlier, which hit earlier this week. Now, Eleanor, I don't know if you've seen that vision, but there was vision of that collision which happened at the airport, and it's obviously a testament to the cabin crew that they managed to get all of those passengers off that Japan Airlines flight.
Unbelievable. Like it's something out of the movie. You sort of see something like that. There are these flames licking all around the aircraft as it's going up, and it's absolutely fantastic that they managed to get all 379 people out. But yeah, very sad that those 5 people died on top of obviously the deaths from the earthquake. So it's a very tough time there in Japan at the moment.
Yeah, and this obviously comes also with that earthquake in one of the busiest travel periods of the year. There's millions of Japanese travelling to and from their hometowns for the New Year's holidays, and Haneda is Japan's busiest airport. Ukraine has suffered a 3rd successive day of airstrikes, leaving at least 5 dead. Russia says it has hit military industrial facilities around Kyiv. Ukraine says debris has hit high-rise flats, warehouses and supermarkets. It comes after Russia's President Vladimir Putin says a Ukrainian air attack on the Russian border city of Belgorod, which killed 25 people, wouldn't go unpunished. Last week, Russia started escalating these attacks, Eleanor, in the region, and Friday saw Russia's biggest aerial bombardment in the war so far, which killed more than 40 people.
I mean, it's incredible that the Ukraine war had started almost 2 years ago now. And it's kind of interesting because this year we had the New Year's messages from the leaders in the conflict, the Ukraine president, obviously, Volodymyr Zelensky, and the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. And very interesting to see the sort of tenors of what they said in these addresses. So Zelensky basically said Ukraine has become stronger and that it will unleash its wrath against Russian forces in 2024, but he didn't make any real direct reference to exactly what's happening on the front line now, or the fact that the counteroffensive that he launched in June has had limited success. He also didn't really mention the difficulties in trying to get more military aid and just normal aid from both the US and the European Union. But he did say that the war has taught Ukrainians to withstand Russian attacks, adapt to hardships, including blackouts, the operation of industry, and threats to shipping exports. So, Rihanna, I think you had a look at what Vladimir Putin said.
Yeah, so Russian President Vladimir Putin didn't mention the war in Ukraine during his New Year's Eve address, which was very different to last year's, which featured soldiers and calls for sacrifice in what Putin cast as a fight for survival. Now, this time Ukraine was not mentioned by name, nor the special military operation, which is Putin's term for the war. But there was also no mention of the Russian soldiers estimated to have been killed or wounded, or the repeated spilling over of the conflict onto home territory, or the armed mutiny in June last year by the late Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of the Wagner mercenary group.
Electricity is still out in large parts of southeast Queensland despite the weather easing there. The Bureau of Meteorology has cancelled quite a few severe weather warnings, but recovery efforts are continuing. At least 700 calls for help have been logged in the last 24 hours, and the Australian Defence Force is out there helping on the ground. Meanwhile, heavy rainfall is still coming down across the southern interior of New South Wales, and that could lead to flash flooding today, Rihanna.
Yeah, look, on the Gold Coast, beaches and theme parks are closed, which comes during the peak tourist season. The loss of tourism is expected to be in the millions of dollars with those closures to those top attractions as well as accommodation cancellations. And yesterday, the Queensland and federal governments announced financial support for businesses and primary producers being affected by all of this wet.
So the interim report into the Sea World helicopter crash has found low concentrations of cocaine in a pilot who died a year ago. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau says it was unlikely, though, to have contributed to the mid-air collision which killed 4 people on the Gold Coast.
Humans we know are susceptible to miscalculations, to not following procedures, and they're the sorts of things that we are very keen to understand.
As Chief Commissioner Angus Mitchell, they're talking about the report and the continued investigation. It's also found some passenger seatbelts weren't worn correctly because of life jackets, but that's also been ruled out as a factor in the deaths.
Eleanor, it's been more than a year since that accident, which saw SeaWorld helicopter chief pilot Ashley Jenkinson and 3 others who died when the chopper he was flying at that popular theme park on the Gold Coast collided with another mid-air. It's understood that that final report will be released in the third quarter of 2024. That other helicopter pilot and 6 of his passengers survived with minor cuts and bruises. But since that incident, SeaWorld Helicopters has brought in several new safety measures, which include things like a new PADBOS traffic advisory role, added air traffic systems to each of its helicopters' avionics systems, increased communication protocols, and also steps to make its helicopters more visible.
There's also some nice news with this. So sadly, Vanessa Tadros, who's a mother, she died in the helicopter crash, but her son survived and he had to have his leg amputated. But he did manage to become a black belt in karate earlier last year. So there's a little bit of nice news from out of all of that tragedy. And a crocodile has leapt into a fisherman's boat in North Queensland. A man was fishing from his tinny north of Mackay at about 10 a.m. on New Year's Eve when he saw a crocodile approaching his boat. This is the stuff of nightmares. The crocodile then swam under the tinny, turned and launched itself into the boat with its jaws wide open. Queensland wildlife officers are now investigating whether there are possible threats to public safety and if they need to try and find and relocate this animal. Rihanna, what do you make of that?
I mean, it's one way to see 2023 out is that you're just minding your own business in your tinny, having a bit of a fish, and next thing there's a crocodile launching at you. I love a crocodile story. You know this. But I think I would be more worried about, is this the new norm? Is this something that if I'm going fishing in my tinny, I have to be worried about launching crocodiles?
I don't think I'm going to be going fishing anytime soon after that.
Thanks, Eleanor. That's it for the headlines. Now let's find out about the boomer divorce rate.
Now let's get into our briefing on boomer breakups. So recent figures released by the Australian Institute of Family Studies show more than a quarter of the divorces granted in 2021, so that's the latest round of stats, involved couples who were married for 20 years or more. And that's up from about 1 in 5 in the 80s and 90s. So while divorce rates are dropping in other age demographics, there was an upward trend for everyone in the 50-plus age group getting divorced. So to help us understand what's going on here, we're joined by Elisabeth Shaw from Relationships Australia. Elisabeth, thanks for joining us. I guess the common perception is that, you know, if you've managed to make it through that turbulent first few years of marriage or even the first few decades of marriage, then it's all smooth sailing. What's going on with these statistics?
Certainly there was an era, particularly probably for grandparents, where there was a real sense you've made your bed and you lie in it. And particularly as the years pass, there's a real sense of there not being much time left. And so why would you break something up? Why would you go to that much trouble? And also you wouldn't have the ambition necessarily to think that another relationship was a good thing, or even time without a relationship was a good thing, because women were very much under the protection of their husbands. So I think that whole vision of the future has really changed, because people are retiring later. Some people aren't even seeing retirement as an aspiration. There's a sense when you get to your 60s that there's a hell of a lot of time left. You could have 20 or 30 solid years left where you could be fit and well. And previously that was not seen to be necessarily likely. So then if you're at the point of your children leaving home, and they are leaving home later, you really could think, gosh, if this is it for me, do I really want to spend the next 20 years with this person? And there's a real decision-making point there, which certainly wasn't there in previous generations.
Do you think too that online dating and potentially, you know, more people making decisions like this means that there's a sense that there could be that person out there for you? I know a lot of older people in my life have reconnected with high school sweethearts on Facebook. So that sense that that's it, it's one and done, and you're not going to find your special person out there later on in life is just not the same anymore.
It's not the same anymore. And certainly, you know, that story about reconnecting with childhood sweethearts, I hear that a lot too. And I've seen people in that situation that, 40-year school reunion can be quite exciting in a range of ways. So things that you wouldn't necessarily expect. There is something about connecting with the past and, either lost loves or the sliding doors moment, what could have been, which is quite tantalising. I think it's true enough that our aspirations about relationships have changed. The idea that you settle and that you go without big chunks of your experience, I think we're challenging that, and there's something about that that's a good thing. It's not about just sort of being a discontent sort of person that, I'm not getting everything I want, so therefore I'm going to bail. I think there's a lot of commentary about that. Are people giving up too easily? But usually where I'm seeing this, it's people who really feel that they've forsaken big chunks of things that they need, someone who they deeply connect with, someone for whom, they're still sexually attracted to each other. A lot of couples, a surprising number of couples, don't ever really talk about their later years and what retirement's going to look like. And it's amazing how many people get to that stage, and one might be saying, I'm really looking forward to pottering around in the garden, and the other one saying, well, I want to travel the world on a yacht. And they find themselves in very, very divergent ideas, values and philosophies. That also can raise quite a lot of difficulties. So, and there may well be, well, I thought you were going to retire. Well, I have no intention of retiring. And if you're still in the workforce, you're still out amongst people, you're still meeting lots of people, you're still very much living in the world and running into different people. And that also keeps you alert to how other people are living and how other people are engaging in possibilities that you might want for yourself.
And do you think women of that age group as well, you know, women in their sort of later 40s, 50s, even into their 60s, they've got a newfound sense of financial freedom that perhaps previous generations didn't have?
That's certainly true. I mean, I guess what we're seeing in a lot of the economic studies are that older women can be most at risk of impoverishment. That certainly is in the case of women who've ended up in ugly divorce settlements where there isn't fairness and justice, or it may be that they've had a traditional role where they haven't had independent income. So we are seeing these extremes, but certainly it's true that for many women there is economic independence. And there's also a sense for women who often have managed the lion's share of domestic and caring responsibilities, that as their caring responsibilities come to an end, particularly with kids, but also perhaps with elderly parents, there is a real sense for women often, not so much about pursuing another relationship, although that definitely can happen too, but also a real longing for time alone. Certainly I'm seeing more older people whose ideal is not necessarily finding another love of their life and moving in. It might be finding a love of their lives and living separately and having a dating relationship, sleepovers, holidays, great companionship and great sex potentially, but not necessarily looking for that whole settled, married and forging a life together. So, and the statistics bear this out, that single person dwellings are the highest growing dwelling form. So I think what we're seeing now is a lot more diversity in possibilities and not a belief that I have to stay with this person and see it out.
This was going to be my next question to you is, you know, if you are the child of parents who are, you know, getting divorced in their 50s or 60s, how do you process that when it brings up some pretty uncomfortable stuff for you that you think to yourself, I'm an adult, I shouldn't be having these feelings. My mum and dad clearly weren't happy, so I should be happy for them in moving on. But I was in my 20s when my parents separated, and it was, you just nailed it. It was really hard for me to accept them moving on. Is that normal?
It is, because there is a sort of neat roadmap, particularly if you've made it into your 20s or even 30s before this happens. It really might have never occurred to you that it could come to this. In fact, sometimes for the couple themselves, one or both are still a bit in disbelief themselves. So I think it's all about bringing family members on the journey. Ideally, the parents themselves start to talk about this and that it's a real option. Sometimes parents will say to their adult children, look, we are going to counselling because we are going through some difficulties. Even that is, at least alerting to the family that there is something afoot. The difficulty is seeing your parents, perhaps one is in great distress about this. It's not that common that two people are equally at the same place around separation. So often there is an initiator and the other is the more reluctant participant, and they can work that through. Obviously, they can work that through where they can make their peace with it, but that is not a quick process. So adult children and even grandchildren can get very caught up in that distress and start to take sides, just like friends can with earlier separations, and start to feel like, well, you're harming mum or dad, and why do this? Why do you need it anyway? If there is somebody else involved, if the provocation for the separation was meeting someone else, it's not common that there were no issues in the relationship. It doesn't mean that's a causal thing, that because there were issues, then an affair is inevitable. I'm not saying that at all, because an affair is a choice and it has all sorts of ramifications. But often couples will say, well, the desire to separate, whether it was because someone else is involved or for some other reason, it generally has come about in a context of something that has slowed down over the years. Couples who perhaps have started to think, well, maybe I should just put up with that even though I don't like it, instead of properly stopping and talking about it. Adult children will have observed some of these things, but for example, if there's more of a failure in in a physical relationship, it may well be that the adult kids may not have much information on that, of course. You kind of hope they don't. So, I think there's a lot in all of that for adult kids to process. So the thing to do is to ask questions, is to say, I'm struggling to understand and, what is it that has happened, and to talk to both people about it and to recognise that everybody actually has an adjustment to make, and these things will go better if everybody can stay sort of curious and respectful of the decision afoot. Sometimes there can be a real rupture that actually recovers, but it is painful. I think for adult children, there's a sense of, oh no, every sort of festival that we're going to have together is now ruined. I'm going to have to work out which parent I invite where, and, all of those things. It's often about that sort of disruption. But just to remember, these things can be worked through. It's all about how the couple themselves separate. If they separate well and as peacefully as possible and as respectfully as possible, the ruptures to the rest of the family don't have to be as significant as they appear in the first instance. Sometimes couples might take a few weeks, months, maybe a couple of years to find their feet, but then there can be a way forward that's easier than you think.
That was Elisabeth Shaw from Relationships Australia. And as I mentioned, my parents were part of this trend as well. And it took my brother and I a little bit of time, and everyone in the family a little bit of time to wrap their heads around that. But if you're going through this right now, some of those tips that Elisabeth mentioned are super, super useful. And, I'm happy to say that everyone in my family is through the other side, and we can all see that it was now for the best. And really all you want for your parents is their happiness at the end of the day.
Listener.